If you're a pastor and you're wondering what would happen if you had to stop working tomorrow, then this video is going to be for you because we're going to talk about succession planning.
So mission explains why you exist. Vision explains where you're going. With that as the backdrop, one of the mistakes that churches make is they wait too late to start thinking about succession.
This is a topic that seems to come up anytime I'm talking with pastors when they talk about what it is that they're concerned about. How are they going to set things up for the future so that the organization's still around even once they're not there anymore?
You know, the health of the church is up there at that sustained health. That's the point that you've got to implement your succession plan.
And to talk about this today, I'm really excited. A special guest, Dale Sellers, the executive director of 95 Networks, that specializes on small churches and really how to help pastors to be effective. Dale, thanks so much for being here. I'm so glad you're here.
Dude, I'm glad to be here too. I can't wait to get in this conversation.
That's awesome. Well, before we dive into this big topic, I would love to just share with everyone a bit about your background and just 95 Networks. So could you just talk us through a little bit about some of the experiences you've had and really what 95 Networks is striving to achieve?
I'll give you the 5-minute overview. So I'll turn 63 next week as the day we were recording this. So I've been in ministry for 43 years, basically from college on. And when I went into ministry, Christian music groups were huge in that time in the 80s and the 90s. So my wife and I traveled on the road the first 10 years we were married. We did about 1,100 concerts in churches all over the country, mostly small and mid-sized churches. And I noticed this theme that would take place when we were in these churches. And it was like most of the pastors or the music pastors and even some youth pastors that we'd meet were all discouraged. And I'm like, I'm high energy and I'm an extrovert. And I'm like, what's wrong with these guys? Where did their fire go? Well, what's happening to these guys? In fact, our group of 20-year-olds would often gather around a pastor and lay hands on them and pray for them and just encourage them. Yeah. And so I took note of that when I was younger. And I'm like, I don't understand what happened to these guys. They started with this fire, this passion. You don't go into ministry for a job. It's a calling. Yeah. And so I couldn't understand. Well, when we came off the road, I started working in a local church. And about 2 weeks into that, I figured out what happened to all those pastors. They had to put up with people.
People problems.
People problems, man. And I'm like, okay. And so I always, this was in the midst of the church growth movement, the seeker movement. Attractional was on the way. And so I always just felt like, well, hey, if I ever pastor a church, it's just going to be a mega church. There's just no doubt about that. And so served on staff, when I came off the road, served on staff at a large church in most capacities you could serve in. And then pastored a small church for 12 years. And our church grew from 30 to 300 back to 150. Because in the 8th year, we had a horrible split. The split was my fault. And what I mean by that is I didn't have a moral failure. I had a leadership failure. I tried to do everything that Bill Hybels and John Maxwell and Fuller and all these people were telling us to do. And it just would not take for what I was doing. It would never gain traction. I always like to say that, if I had eight focuses of leadership in our church, I would appoint someone to lead those areas. And it was like spinning plates. I'd get this plate spinning. And when I went to go help one person, this guy over here would intentionally drop his plate. So I would come back to him. And I discovered that they wanted to be my friend, but they didn't really want to grow as leaders and develop a church. And that's when I began to realize I used to ask myself this question: at what point do you leave? How do you know when you've been there long enough? Yeah. And what I recognized was those people loved me, they believed in me, they wanted to be my friend, but I could not inspire them to move forward in ministry. And I knew then that the end was in sight. And so that kind of was the backdrop to a few years of, I actually left ministry, went back into construction. I grew up building houses with my dad, got my builder's license when I was 18. So I've always had to fall back on. And then got this divine call, if you will. God wanted me to move into more of a leadership development area. And started off with my own consulting company, got trained in something called StratOp, worked for the Unstuck group with Tony Morgan for a couple of years, and then became the executive director of 95 Network. The name 95 stands for the fact of the 300,000 plus churches in America, 95% of them are considered to be small or mid-size. Which means that they're all under 500, 87% under 200, 75% of all the churches in America are under 100, and those are pre-pandemic numbers. So it's actually skewed lower than that now. And what I recognized is that most of the resources available today don't relate to the context of a smaller mid-sized church pastor. And so when I was asked to start, I didn't found 95 Network. A guy named Jim Powell in Peoria, Illinois, founded it, but he asked me to take over. And our whole heart is this: we want to come along beside the small and mid-sized church leader. I understand the discouragement. I understand the dynamics. I was one, and just really encourage them. If a small church pastor goes to a regular conference, they walk away with one of two thoughts. They walk away with one going, man, I'm so glad that church can do that. I could never do that. They see the things that they see. Or two, they come back to their small church and try to implement the things they saw at the big church, and they get fired 2 weeks later because they bought a hazer, not a smoker, but a hazer, and put it in the church, and the people think they set the church on fire.
Great.
So our whole angle, everything about us, it comes out of that experience of being on the road, seeing discouraged pastors, and realizing there's just not a lot of resources for the small and mid-sized church leader. And so that's kind of an overview.
Yeah, I love that. And there's, oh man, so much we could unpack there, particularly when we connect to Nehemiah, where you see, leadership is a strength that God provided in his experience, his disposition, and his willingness to answer the call, and really playing that out in terms of, first getting people mobilized, getting an operating system in place, and then really growing not just the little part of the city, the nation, and you really see all these things coming out of it.
Yeah.
And for a lot of pastors, that's a real struggle to know how to do that. And I really like the way you kind of presented that. They can walk away from that thinking like totally overwhelmed, or or just almost like going right to the end rather than the journey along the way.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like to say this, John, that to me, it's very simple why 95% of our churches are small or mid-sized. It's one of two reasons.
Yeah.
Either one is the pastor needs to do everything to be validated. In other words, they need to fill their emotional tank because so many pastors are insecure. And also, I learned from Barner recently that a very large percentage of pastors are introverts. And so they don't hand things off because they need to be needed. And so that's one of the problems. The bigger problem is the governmental structure of most American churches is not biblical, it's American. So they view the pastor as a hireling. And I'll just say it this way: God can't release great growth and blessing there because they haven't set it up the way he designed it to be set up. So we got a lot of things to work on.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom in on that for a minute. Just the hireling phenomenon. Talk a little bit more about what you mean by that and some of the problems that you see stemming from that.
Well, I know because you and I have talked before. I know you're huge in leadership development. Well, there's actually, in my lifetime, there's been a huge pushback from small and mid-sized church pastors that's not even a biblical model. I had a pastor tell me one time, leadership development's not even in the Bible. And I looked at him and said, do you know this guy named Jesus? That's what he did for 3 years with his disciples. You can call it discipleship or leadership development, whatever. But the bottom line is this, John: a lot of pastors have not been trained or equipped to lead. They're great at teaching about the Bible. They can do funerals. They can do baby dedications and weddings and all those tasks. But as far as being visionary, and again, if you look at that second model that I gave you earlier, if a church, if they own, some people's mindset is they own the church and the pastor's a hireling, the pastor can't really have a vision because the people don't buy into it. They don't want the pastor to have a vision. And so there's a constant friction that's happening. A lot of pastors feel very ill-equipped to do what they need to do when it comes to leading people. Most pastors don't know how to lead board meetings. Most pastors just don't know how to cast vision or develop. And some of them don't feel called to do that, so they don't even try. And so one of the things I learned, John, I don't know if anybody's ever talked to you about this, but one of the things I learned when I was pastoring was I used to feel angry intimidated and want to label somebody as a Jezebel if they came to me with this vision idea. And what I recognized was sometimes those people, they love Jesus, they love the church, and they loved me, but because I wasn't casting any vision, they wanted to help things along.
Mm.
And because I wasn't willing to go there, I felt the pressure from underneath pushing me to lead. And you can't push someone to lead. And I think a lot of pastors feel that pressure. And when people want to reach their community, and we as the leaders are not casting any vision, John, lots of churches never baptize anybody. Lots of churches never see any conversions. It's an area where when you have people in your congregation that really want to see something happen, if you're not leading that, if you're not saying this is where we're going, if you are not declaring, hey, this is the mission of our church, which is why we exist, if you're not communicating those things, sometimes people will take it in their own hands.
Yeah. Well, and then you have people in the congregation creating their own vision, and surprisingly, it kind of fuels their
Well, John, here's what I say:
personal
if you
priority.
have more than one vision, you have division.
Right.
Just
I like that.
it's just simple.
Without one vision, you have division.
Yep.
I like that. That's
Mhm.
really good. Well, and so let's talk about, vision. One of the questions I often ask to just be thought provoking around vision is, if you were able to be a fly on the wall at the 100-year anniversary of whatever you're initiating right now, what would you hope would be the big themes of the speech that's given to kind of celebrate the organization? Or, what would, so, vision being that thing that's like way out in the future. I think that brings us right to that whole discussion about succession planning. If we're thinking long-term vision, what vision really should be, it should go beyond just the individual people that are in the church today, the individual pastor or leader who's overseeing that church today. What are some things that any church could do to start to be purposeful about that succession planning?
Well, it starts with the definition of mission and vision. And I realize some people flip this from what I'm going to say, and I don't care. If you want to call it, if you want what I call mission, if you want to call vision, that's fine. But what we teach at 95 Network is that your mission literally describes why you exist, and you should be able to state it in 12 words or less.
Yeah.
Because if you go to most churches and ask for their mission statement, it's 5 pages long. It's written in King James English and calligraphy. And it means it's just a bunch of words. And churches specifically feel like they have to over spiritualize it. And all I'm saying is you just need to know, why did God raise your church up in your community at this time? And why are you there as the leader at this time? So understand why you exist. And then what we do is with vision, we try to keep vision no more than 3 years out. I went to a church one year or many years ago that my wife and I attended, and we paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for this company to come in and do a 20-year vision planning thing. And all that happened there was we lost a couple $100,000.
Right.
Nobody knows what's going to happen in 20 years. But we kind of cut it off. Where do you think? So mission explains why you exist. Vision explains where you're going. With that as the backdrop, one of the mistakes that churches make is they wait too late to start thinking about succession. My friend Tony Morgan did a life cycle of the church in a bell curve. And basically he went from this. He said, it starts with the launch, and then you have this thing called momentum growth. And then after a while, when you've had momentum growth, you have to move to what he calls strategic growth, which means you got to hire some staff. You got at least, if it's growth, you got to get a pastor, maybe somebody to keep the books or whatever. But then you get up to this top of the curve, and he called that sustained health. And that's where the life of the church happens. I mean, it's when everything's going on. And then you move down the belt, and he called at that particular part there, he called that maintenance. And then below maintenance, he called preservation. And then below preservation, he called life support. I did not understand until Tony taught me this, that once you get into that maintenance mentality, that's usually the high point of the church. You got the most people coming, you have the most staff, your finances are good, you're known in the community. But the shift of the church moves inward. And you start thinking about satisfying saints instead of saving sinners. And then when you get into preservation mode, you don't make any changes because you got to preserve what you have. And then when you get into life support, you're in too much fear to do any change. But what Tony told us was, the health of the church is up there at that sustained health. That's the point that you've got to implement your succession plan. When you're healthy, you've been pastoring for 5 years and you think you're going to be there 20 more years, now is the time to begin to identify young people, to begin to talk to the board, to begin to talk to the church, because you got to hand it off. And I want to tell you a personal story. So if people listening know who Tony Morgan is, Tony passed away this past Labor Day. He's 50, under 55. Shocked us, just rocked our world, because he's such a gift to the church. And Tony and I were scheduled to do a podcast the next day, to record a podcast. And I was going to ask him this question: if everything on the earth has a life cycle, does the local church have a life cycle? If everything on the earth, it has a birth and a growth and a thriving, and then it drops off and it dies. Everything does. Did the church? And I knew he was going to tell me, no, it doesn't. And what Tony would have told me, I'm sure, is that when you get to that point at the top of the curve, when everything's good and you've got growth and there's momentum, that's when you have to begin to identify succession. I've watched people, and I'm not going to say any names because all these people, I'm not criticizing them, but I've watched famous pastors wait too long to begin to implement succession. They wait till they're ready to leave. And it's hard for pastors to implement it when they need to, because it's when they're the most successful. But that's when you begin to identify. That's when you begin to begin to communicate with the church. We've got to hand this thing off to the next generation so this church continues to go higher and further.
Yeah. So what are some practical steps? So you just kind of identified two things: identify the need for succession planning, start to communicate that need. What are some practical steps a leader might take in? Well, I always go to the Nehemiah playbook is, pray, plan, prepare. What would be some of the steps that would fit into that to start to move that forward?
Hey, you nailed the prayer part, which is, I want people to understand this is just understood. Again, with what we do at 95 Network, we're much more into the practical things that people do, because we assume that you're spending time with God. We assume that you're praying. We assume that you've theologically, you know where you are. So these are the more hands-on structural things. The most important thing you can do beyond prayer is begin to identify and mentor young people. And what I mean by that is, it's like, okay, if you go to a conference, so often people go to a conference by themselves. And we always ask this question: why didn't you bring somebody with you? Well, why don't you and I had some pastors and some leaders specifically do this for me, which is why I'm where I am today, is they took me under their wing. So you've got to start. And look, John, this is so important. Nobody comes to you ready-made. Nobody comes to your church except from another church. That's another podcast. But the gold comes to you with dirt on it. Diamonds come to you with dirt on them. Silver has dirt on it. And for you to mine that out, you gotta deal with the dirt. And so what you got to do is you have to shift your thinking as a pastor. I'm not saying you don't minister to your senior saints. I realize you're there to shepherd the flock, but you have got to have an intentional plan and budget time on a weekly basis to where you're investing in the next generation, where you're pouring into them. You're trying to identify gifts, and then you involve them in the church service in meaningful areas. So let them be part of the Sunday service. And I don't mean just being an usher. Let them do some things. Let them lead worship. Let them maybe preach from time to time. You've got to begin to integrate them now while the church is healthy, so that when it's time that they mature and they're ready, and you're not throwing them under the bus, if you will.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways, like what would be some examples of, maybe areas where you would want to bring young people in, and how would you go about doing that?
I think for me, as the senior leader, you can sense and see where God's working in certain young people, especially if you can see that He's maybe calling them into ministry. And one of the wise things someone did for me, I went to a fellow when I felt like I was being called in ministry, who was also in ministry when I was in a senior in high school, and I was telling him, I said, I really feel like God's calling me into ministry. And I said, and he said, well, what are you feeling? And we talked through it. And I said, well, can you tell me how God called you? And he goes, nope. He says, if I tell you how God called me, if He doesn't call you exactly the same way, you won't feel called. And so what you have to do is you've got to spend time. It's not raising your kids. The Bible says train up your children in the way they should go, so when they're old, they'll not depart from it. And what that literally means is I had 3 daughters. I trained all 3 of those daughters in some ways the same, but also I identified their specific bents, where their gifts were, how God created them. And so you have to help identify these young people and then spend time with them, just helping them to develop what God's called them to do, who he is developing them to be. That's one of the huge things you can do is just budget time, and it can be a Bible study. It could be just gathering with them on an afternoon, after school, for an hour, just to hang out and talk. It doesn't always have to be super spiritual, because you want them to find that Jesus has called them completely. What I mean by that is every area of their life, not just their spiritual life.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, my experience, and I suspect you might share similar things. Most churches don't do this, at least in any kind of structured or systemic way. Why not?
Oh, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. When a pastor's insecure, insecurity is one of the big issues we deal with at 95 Network. If I'm insecure, I can't hand things off because somebody might do better than me. Let's say I have a young person, that obviously God's called them, and they're a very good communicator. And when they preach, and I actually know stories where this happened. When they preach, people are more drawn to them than me. So I don't let them preach. So if my insecurity is high, I will not hand off. I will not raise up. I will not release. And again, if I need to be needed, or if I need to fill my emotional tank, I won't raise up people. It's kind of like, John Maxwell talked about the law of the lid. And basically, on a scale of 1 to 10, just random numbers, on a scale of 1 to 10, if I'm a 4 as a leader and God sends a 6 to me, I will either run that person off, or I'll help dumb them down and not give them opportunities, because I can't let them get higher than me out of my own insecurity.
That's interesting. So, I don't know. I guess the root cause analysis light bulb in my head's now going off, and ready to do the 5 whys. But why? What do you think's behind that? Like,
Well, for me, it was just my own insecurity came out of my deficiency of growing up with my dad, just needing verbal affirmation. And I didn't get that. And so I kind of translated that over to my walk with God. It could come from all kind of things. I think one of the huge things that affects us is comparison. If you and me went to school together, and then you get married, I get married, and you go at a church, and I'm at a church, and let's say your church is 300-400 people, and my church, is 50 or 60 people. If I saw you, if my wife and I went out to eat, and we went to the same restaurant you did, if I saw you before you saw me, I'd leave. Not because of you, but because of me, because I felt so ashamed. That's why I wrote the book Stalled, was because I felt like I'd be there by now, and I wasn't. And so I was constantly comparing myself and not measuring up to everybody else. And all that is it's godless. It's not the way Jesus keeps us, but it's kind of what got on the inside of me. And again, this is the residue of growing up in the secret, or the secret time, the attractional time, where you got mega churches everywhere. And I'm not anti mega church. I'm not anti any church. But I will say that one of the things that we don't have in a lot of small church is health. We're not healthy. We're just existing. And you don't get healthy just because you think you should be. You got to put effort into it. And so a lot of our leaders are unhealthy, and honestly, you need to find out the source of where that's from, and it will definitely affect you raising up and handing off ministry.
yeah, I almost hear you saying, and correct me here if I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I almost hear you saying that the succession planning almost like is a place where God can really lean in on sanctification for an individual pastor as they're just in their own journey, their own walk. And I don't know, I'd just be interested in your take on that, or maybe a retake on that.
I think pastoring we've made it way too complicated.
Mhm.
I think if we just study Ephesians 4, the Lord tells us through Paul, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you ministry gifts, and pastor is one of those gifts. And their job is to equip saints to do ministry. We don't do that. That is
Mm,
not what we do in the American church. We don't equip saints to do ministry. If our churches grow, we hire staff. And again, I'm not anti-hiring staff, but the biblical model is to help people identify their gifts, raise them up, train them, and release them. If you look at verses 13, 14, 15, and 16, following of Ephesians 4, 11, and 12, it basically says we're going to have maturity, stability, integrity, and then we'll have community. And that last verse 16 says where every part's doing its share and everybody's supplying. You don't see that in many churches.
mm,
And again, it goes back to that root problem that I mentioned earlier about how it's either the pastor is insecure, so they don't raise it up, hand off things to people, or the church views the pastor as the hireling, and they don't really want to reach new people. You just got to be honest. If your church has gone a year and you've not baptized one soul, and nobody in your church is upset about it, you got a problem.
mm,
The whole atmosphere, there's a problem, and it probably is you have a bunch of satisfied saints who are getting what they want, who just they exist to hear the music they heard when they were saved 30 years ago, and I think we can blend. I'm not one of these people that says, oh, let's just get rid of all the old people. I don't believe that. I think everything we have today is built on the shoulders of our senior saints and really those in the graveyard, and we should honor that. But I have no problem looking at the older people and saying, listen, we can't put new wine in old wineskins.
mm.
And I didn't make that up. Jesus gave us that example. And so there's not a lot of new wine in most churches because they won't change the wineskins. And so there's just a lot of unhealth that needs to be dealt with, and it can come from a lot of areas, or you may just be discouraged like I was, where I just felt like I was a failure.
Yeah. So, pastors starting to think about succession planning broadly,
Mhm.
what are, you mentioned the example of, in a sense, like kind of starting to train up or mentor maybe a next pastor. What are some maybe next tier opportunities for succession planning within the church? Like, what are a few areas where you've seen churches be very effective at, starting to prepare the next generation, not just in the eldership or pastor role, but other aspects of effectively running the church.
I think one of the greatest things that's happened to the American church, and this is going to seem so odd with everything we've been talking about, is multi-site. I think multi-site's great. Now, I prefer myself. I would prefer to hear a live speaker versus watching it on video. I'm not knocking the churches that do that because some of them do it very well. But
Yeah.
me personally, but here's the thing: if you're multi-site, instead of building this humongous auditorium, with 5,000 seats that sits empty all week long, why
Mm,
not? Why not multi-site? Why not go to the areas where people are coming from and raise up people from within? Your pastor, your music person, your youth person, your children's person, your support personnel. I guarantee you, those people probably exist in your church. Raise them up. And then provide for them. Let them work out of the main campus, the mothership, if you will, and so that you can train them, you can mentor them, you can answer their questions. There's a huge push in America to plant churches, which I get that because church planners are their mentality is, but the population is growing so much. Here's the problem with most church planning organizations: they put people out before they're ready.
mm,
And so it's like upwards of 90% or somewhere in that crazy number of church plants don't make it 3 years. And it's because the people weren't trained. Most church plants start with a big splash, and so you do a big push, you do a big splash, you spend all this money, and you get a couple hundred people show up, and the next week there's 20 people.
mm.
And most people are not trained to take those 20 and change a community. Now, I want to tell you, this guy named Jesus took 12 people. One of them didn't make it, and took 3 years and poured into them. And we're here today because of them. So it can be done, but there's a lot. There's got to be a shift in a lot of our thinking with how we go about doing this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I like the way you just framed that. In fact, as you were talking about it, made me think of Brad House's book, Multi-Site, and,
Mhm.
talking about, instead of growing that one big mega location, how do we, present lots of smaller locations that make it accessible to groups of people and give it that smaller feel. And yet at the same time, pursue the larger vision and mission of the organization, the church. And I think, what you just described, it's like giving more opportunities instead of having, one location, which has one worship leader, one preacher,
Mhm.
one, now you have all these other areas where leadership development comes with experience, not just education and learning, right?
So let's say I hired you to come on staff with me and be my executive pastor. That'd be the role you're in. When I hire you, we're going to sit down and all I want you to have in your job description are 8 points. I don't want you to have 20. Most churches, if they even write a job description, you would not believe the amount of churches that at the last thing on the job description it says this, and anything else we need you to do. That's not fair. So
Great.
so my thing is, I'm gonna give you 8 things that on your job description that you are responsible for, and we're not going to hire you until you and me agree on those 8 things.
Mm.
Of those 8 things, 5 of them I don't want you ever doing. I want you doing through other people, because I'm going to require you to be a leader, developing leaders in your staff position. The top the 2 and 3 at the top, I want you doing with someone. And then only one thing in your job description do I expect you to do, because that is your uniqueness that really, other people can do it, but they can't do it quite like you. But
Mhm.
if I hire you on my staff and you're not raising up leaders and you're not training leaders, then that just tells me that when you're gone in 3 years, which is the norm, I have to
Mhm.
start over again. I'll give you an example, even with succession planning. We have a church here in South Carolina. Pastor's been there for 45 years.
Wow.
45 years. Healthy church. It's a mid-sized church. It's vibrant. It's alive. The dude just retired a few months ago, and now they have to hire a search committee to start all over again. And I'm like, what is wrong with you people? He's been there 45 years. Did you not at some point begin to think he's going to retire at some point? And honestly, I put the responsibility on the leader. That at least 5 years ago, because I mean he knew he was going to retire.
Yeah.
It just disrupts the whole flow, and sometimes that is the turning point where that church begins down the bell curve into life support, because they, when they were healthy, they didn't make that change, and they didn't think that way.
Yeah. It's interesting just that when you said the word search committee,
Yeah.
that that seems like maybe an indicator that there hasn't been strong succession planning. I don't know what you think about
Any church that has, in which most churches do, they have a search committee, or you know, uh, it's just not a biblical model. I'll leave that alone.
that. Yeah. Well, I'll poke at it a little bit,
Okay.
because I think I've heard you hint at it a few times. A biblical model versus, we'll say, American model.
Mhm.
Like, and maybe put a little definition around those for us.
Well, one of the things that you and I talked about this off mic earlier. And I'm not upfront. I'm telling you, I'm not anti-education. But one of the things that I think has got us off balance in American churches is we value education above anointing. And what
Mm.
I mean is if someone has, a PhD behind their name, it doesn't matter whether they're a good leader or a good communicator, or there's any growth happening, or whether anybody's getting saved. They've got the degree. And so sometimes what happens is we get so educated that we don't have the ability to communicate and reach people. Most pastors never interact with lost people. So how are you going to train your people how to reach lost people when you yourself don't reach lost people?
Mm.
And so that feeds this problem that we have, to where our model's broken. Is the best way to say that. Our
Yeah.
model is broken, and if we're not equipping people and releasing people and identifying people with their gifts, uh, then we're not doing what Ephesians 4 told us to do.
Yeah. What are some examples of things you see as like alternatives to that, or things that are maybe being put in place instead of that type of a model?
Well, what in which way are you asking me this?
Just maybe like, corporate governance, or just things that are maybe like overly human, I guess, as opposed to for trusting God from a leadership perspective, or just, more American versus being biblical.
I think that probably the biggest contributor to all this is the leader coming in, not understanding the context of the church. We have lots of rural churches, and the context of how you do ministry in a rural setting versus an urban setting. While there are some leadership principles that are across the board, you can't lead that church the same way. Typically, a rural church is led by a family that may have founded it, and they may have the mentality that's kind of like their church. And
Mm.
as a leader, you've got to to get to know them enough to be able to talk to them about winning people to Jesus and reaching people for, in the kingdom. And when you aren't able to do that, then, typically what happens, instead of the church growing, you're going, because you're not going to be able to connect there. And I will say this too, John, there's thousands of churches a year closing. There are thousands of churches a year closing, and we're not starting new ones as fast that are healthy. And again, Jesus is not panicked about this, because some of these churches, because they're not impacting the community at all, will probably need to close. And I think one of the things that happens in a lot of settings is, we're just not known in the community whatsoever. And then add to that dynamic, as we record this, I'm a baby boomer, and I'm the baby of the baby boomers, and we are aging out. Baby boomers have been your givers, they've been your tithers, they've been your attenders, and we are retiring, we are dying, and our model of how we've done church is not connecting with millennials and the next generations behind. Now, there's a huge move in those generations to come back to church, but they're not going to come to what we've been doing. And I had to give you a great quote. I had a board member of a church that I used to attend tell me this. He said, "Dale, the problem is we just need to get the young people in here and teach them the old ways." And I looked at him, and his name was Jack. I said, "Jack, if they wanted to know the old ways, they'd be here." And he also looked at me and said, "Well, if this church has to change, I would rather it close." And it did. So you have to deal with that mentality. And one of the things I have to deal with as a consultant in serving churches is, Jesus can do anything. He's a miracle worker, but some churches are very close to the brink of no return. And it's like with Tony's life cycle. Once they get in preservation mode and life support, when you're on life support, you don't go back to health. When you're on life support, you either pull the plug and die, or you relaunch. And relaunch does not mean you just change the name and keep doing what you're doing. One of the issues, I think, John, that's huge right now, is this revitalization movement, which is great that churches are being revitalized if they are. But the problem is, if you change the name of the church and paint the building and stick some young people on the stage, but you don't change your overall mission and vision that wasn't working, then all you've done is kick the can down the road 10 years. I see that happening a lot right now.
Yeah. What do you think a church that's in that mode, like, what's the right play? Like, is there a scenario where someone just says intentionally we should either roll into another church or close down, or is it really just a question of the right pastor feeling the calling to go in and do a reboot? Like, is it better to reboot, or is it better to start over?
If you're in life support, you won't do a reboot. You'll have to relaunch, and relaunching is starting over. I think one of the cool things that's happening in some places is, some churches are aging out, and they're giving their stuff away, their buildings, their facilities, their land to younger churches that are vibrant and alive. There's a lot of friction that happens there. One of the things that's really a little scary that's happening some is church mergers. They don't tend to work when you try to merge, because it's like a two-headed monster. And so I'm sure it can work, and it has in some scenarios, but it's probably not worked more. But when you have Andy Stanley introduced this idea 25 years ago, and he got crucified for it. But he basically said, "Hey, if you have a church and you're aging out and you're not going to attract new people, why don't you give it away to the next generation?" And people thought he lost his mind. Well, that's been happening a lot lately. But I will tell you about here locally, we have a church within an hour of where I live, and it was down to 5 senior ladies. And I'm talking about, this is a 300-seat auditorium on, I don't know, 20 acres, and no pastor. And a young church actually approached them and said, "Hey, would you mind merging or whatever?" And they said, "Oh, that'd be great. That'd be awesome. We'd love for you to come here, as long as you keep doing things the way we've been doing them." And they're like, "We can't do that. We're not going to dishonor you by coming in and just doing opposite of what you said. But if your mentality is, we got to keep doing what we've always done, you're going to die." And that's just some of the realities of some of the stuff we're dealing with. Now, there are great movements happening in America in pockets right now, where millennials and the next generations are hungry to know truth, and they're pursuing a relationship with God, and they're looking for churches that are alive. And my hope is that churches won't miss this opportunity to change and connect with them, because I just had someone on the podcast recently, and they talked about how that young millennial men are coming back to churches in groves right now. I hadn't seen this in my lifetime. So
yeah, well, and I've even seen evidence that it's Gen Zs that are coming out of college earlier in their career, starting to look at going back to church. Maybe in some cases, even there almost seems to have been a push to more liturgical churches.
the
And
Anglican Church is one of the fastest growing churches in
yeah,
America. Isn't
yeah.
that
And
funny?
so it is. And
And it's
so
because they're looking for stability. They want to know those truths
yeah,
but and structure. But they're tired of the show. They're tired of the game. And look, I'm not saying this just about contemporary churches. One of the things someone told me one time said the problem with those big churches is all they do is entertain.
mm,
I can probably show you that in most churches are about entertainment, in the sense that they meet people where they want to be met.
right.
People choose their church because of the prefaces that they have, the things they're looking for. And so, it's not, people don't come to just big churches because of the entertainment value, but I guess I should leave that
Right.
one alone too.
It's the pomp and the circumstance of of every church's order, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Pick
yeah.
and choose, man. It's buffet.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think that it points to something interesting. I think, the Gen X generation, the millennials have had a certain skepticism
Mhm.
towards faith and religion, and they've also had kind of an expectation of being entertained. It does seem like the Gen Z, at least on the surface, at this point, authenticity is more the priority.
Absolutely, because they've been I mean, they have everything you could imagine with their iPhone and all the technology and social media, and they're the most lonely, isolated group of people we've ever seen. And they're
Yeah.
looking for a relationship. And I will say this, one of the great values that older churches have is so many young people are looking for spiritual grandpas and grandmas and moms and dads. And so older people have such an opportunity right now to just spend time with young people, to get to know them. If they won't prejudge them, if they won't tell them, hey, get rid of those tats, or get rid of those ear piercings, or your hair color, and then I'll talk to you. If they'll get past that stuff and stop prejudging them, there's a great opportunity for older adults to have a major impact right now, because the younger generations are looking for that.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. So, talk to me a little bit about what 95 Networks does, as and I know I know you've got a conference coming up.
Mhm.
Talk about some of the things you do to come alongside churches that are really trying to rethink, or just dig into some of the problems they have, rethink the way they're doing things, and yet not losing in any sense or diluting the gospel discipleship. Really the priority of God's calling. Just talk me through a little bit how you work with churches.
What we do is we do what we call the 5 C's. There are 5 different focuses, if you will, of 95 Network. One of them's content. I had you recently on our podcast. We do a weekly podcast. It's designed, whatever the topic is, with the small and mid-sized church leader in mind. We used to write more articles, but we just discovered people weren't reading them as much. In fact, if I do an email now, I always embed a video in it, because people won't read the email. Because again, people are bombarded with that stuff.
Sure.
And so we do content. One of the huge things we do is something called connection, which is why I've met you. If someone comes to me and they need help in an area, I have a real passion to be able to hand them off to someone that I've vetted that can help them. There are things I can't do everything. I'm gifted at what I'm gifted at. So I would rather hand them off to someone who's really good in a specific arena. And so we do that. Another thing we do is coaching. We've got multiple coaching tracks where we come along beside, and when we do this, we only do like 6 months worth of coaching or less, because one of the huge identifiers in a small and mid-sized church is that we don't follow through, and there's no accountability. And so I already know, we cut the time limit even on our conferences, which is another one of our C's. We cut it down to a half day, because if something's long or if something requires endurance, people, they don't follow through with it. And so
Yeah.
so we've got you got your content and your connections. You got coaching. You've got the conferences that you had mentioned that we do, and then the last thing we do is something called consulting. I mentioned earlier that I was trained in Stratop, and I worked at the Unstuck group for a couple of years. And what I've done is I created a thing called Vision Day, where we come and we work with an individual church for a day, and usually it's on a Saturday because most of their leaders are volunteers or they're bored, and we spend a few hours together and we help them identify their mission and vision. We help them identify who they're trying to reach. We kind of talk through what's worked for them, what's not worked for them. And then we come up with one action item that may break down into a couple of categories, but we come up with one action item for them to focus on for the next year and a half, so that they can begin to rally around that thing. And because what happens if you solve the right action item, it will solve other problems.
Mm.
One of our issues in small and mid-sized churches is we're known for doing 20 things poorly instead of one or two things really well.
Mm.
And the reason we do that is because we try to offer everything. A church of 50 tries to offer the same thing that the church down the street of 3,000 offers, and you can't do it. And we feel guilty because we can't do it. And so what we try to help them do is, look, you can't do all that stuff. So who has God called you to be? What is your unique mission? And so we want to help you identify that and then focus in on that. And then, having a clear mission and vision helps you to say yes to the right things, but it also helps you say no to other right things. And what I mean by that is, once you get momentum, I think you've probably seen this, when you get momentum going, all of a sudden everybody has all these ideas of things we need to be doing. And they may be great ideas. Like I use Celebrate Recovery as a great example. It's a parachurch thing that's very powerful ministry. But if we've met together and we've spent a day and we've been our plan, and we come up with an action item, and Celebrate Recovery has not been mentioned whatsoever, somebody's going to come along at some point and say, hey, we need to start Celebrate Recovery. And when you have clarity on your mission and vision, when you know what your action item is, you can say no to that right now. Past churches have a hard time saying no. So if you don't say no, then you start packing it back on again. And once again, you're known for doing 20 things poorly. And so you need that clarity so you know where you're going, why you're doing it. And then once you get that accomplished, you do another Vision Day. And so those are the 5 C's.
Yeah, I love that. And you had mentioned off camera, you have a conference coming up. What if someone was interested in that? What are some of the characteristics of that? What would be some of the things they would gain from that?
Started a new conference. Our team meets together, tries to meet every January. We have people from all over the country. We come in here in South Carolina and we pray, and I spend the first part of the morning just praying, seeking God. And what we do is we analyze everything we do at 95 Network. We see what's working, what's not working, making sure it's connecting with what people really, because you can offer things that people aren't looking for, and so that's why we meet. And we also go, hey, there's something we need to be addressing that we're not addressing. And so a couple of years ago we met, and that's when we came up with our Soul Care Essentials Conference. It's a half-day conference. It just talks about your private life, what's going on inside your head, your personal life, what's happening in your relationships, and then your professional life. And one of the issues a lot of pastors are facing in their professional life is whether to go bivocational or not. And so we talk about that. This year we met and we came up with a new conference, and we're calling it Cultivating Principles, Equipping Principles for Cultivating a Healthy, Thriving Church. And these are just basic, simple, practical things. We've got some tools that we bring along where we do Q&A with the pastors and the leaders, just trying to help them understand what are the principles that help make a healthy, thriving church. And that's the new conference we're doing. If you want to know about them, you can literally go to our website, which is 95network.org. It's the numbers 9 and 5, not the word 95. And just click the conferences, or it'll tell you all about the detail. It lets you know all the different headings that we're covering and the topics. And we've done almost 100 and something of those things over the last few years.
That's excellent. Yeah, and I'll include that link
Yeah.
down below in the description. Dale, how could if someone wanted to engage with you or get in contact with you, what are some ways they might connect, and what are some maybe resources you'd recommend from 95 Networks?
Everybody just call John, and John can just let me know. I'm just kidding. Just again, the number's 95. So Dale at 95network.org. That's my email. That's the easiest way to do that. I would like to highly recommend, I wrote a book that's called Stalled: Hope and Help for Pastors Who Thought They'd Be There by Now. David C. Cook produced it, and they distributed it for me. I'm trying to think of the word for authors. I can't.
Publisher.
Publish is the word.
Yeah,
Thank you. Just
yeah.
totally different. But I wrote that book, and it's a very transparent understanding of what it's like to feel like that you're stalled in ministry, and then I offer lots of solutions for what you need to do to move forward with that.
I
It's
have a copy right
there,
here.
right there. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
stalled. Yeah, you
yeah.
can get it on Amazon, or you can get it through our website. I highly recommend, especially if you feel stalled. The worst thing you can do is when you're stalled is just to stay there. And I even give this example at the start of the book. I used to, when I did construction, I was building a house for our family, and it was a log house. And what you have to do when you build a log house is you have to rent this huge forklift. And I love to play on stuff like that. And so, I mean, I got this forklift. The tires are as tall as me.
Nice.
And because I got to move all these heavy logs, and so I'm
Every
like,
kid's dream.
and so of course they bring in a day early. Of course, I've got to go move some stuff around, So I'm out there, I'm playing, and so there are 3 tractor trailers coming on Thursday to deliver my stuff that I have to take off with this forklift because they're flatbeds. And the day before, I'm out there playing on the thing, and there was this cube of bricks, and the forklift had a really long boom arm you could stick out. So I knew the ground was wet, but I thought if I used the boom arm, hey, that'll be great. I started trying to pick up that cube of bricks, and I didn't realize it, but every time I moved, I was burying that forklift, and I buried it so bad that it was sitting on its belly, and all 4 tires were spinning.
Oh no.
And so I was stalled. And I had to solve that problem because tomorrow morning those trucks are coming. So I had to call a friend of mine with a bulldozer. He had to bring his bulldozer to my property and get me unstuck. I was so humiliated and so embarrassed. But I think that describes where a lot of pastors are. You're just sitting there spinning in the mud, and you keep thinking, oh, it's going to get better. It's going to work itself out. It never does. This is just going to solve itself. You got to reach out for help. And so I think the book would be helpful. Also, I encourage you, if you have not done this, get a counselor.
Yeah, right.
Counseling is very helpful.
Yeah. I think I also heard in there 95 Networks is the bulldozer that can pull you out of the mud or something like that.
Yeah. The thing I will say about that is if we can't help you, again, with the connections piece, we're going to connect you with someone who can. You can just look, if you look at that tab on our website on connections, we've just got a long list of people that are specialized that can help you. And, the cool thing I think about this side of the pandemic, I am seeing pastors reach out for help more than I've ever seen that before. And that's encouraging.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Dale, thanks so much for being here. This has been an awesome conversation. I really feel like you've illuminated a lot of things that will be helpful for pastors, particularly those that are really starting to think intentionally about how do we prepare the next generation to fuel the mission and to pursue the vision, even beyond those who are in the seats right now. I think that's going to be a really powerful message.
Yeah, just don't wait too late. Don't wait. Don't wait till it's, where you're doing succession planning in a panic. It never works out good like that. Let's do it now while things are going good, which again is opposite of the way we think.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for answering God's call and building this ministry. And just, heard so many stories of pastors and churches that you've helped. And, this is a great opportunity to, for anyone who's just thinking about these things to start to ask these questions. So really glad you were here. Maybe just as a wrap up, I always like to ask what's maybe one of your favorite Nehemiah moments from that book of the Bible, and just to kind of connect to you or your life in some way.
I just remember he was in Ono and his enemies came and tried to get him to come down. And he just said, oh no, I can't go. I just think sometimes just say, oh no, I'm not coming down. I'm on task. I'm on point. I'm getting it done. And I'm not coming. And so that's my favorite Nehemiah. Oh no, I can't come.
You're right. I love it. Well, what a great example of knowing what to say no to.
Yes.
So that you can
That's
focus
hard,
on
man.
what God has called you to say yes to.
It's hard for us. We want to please everybody. And when you do that, you don't please anybody. So
yeah. Amen. Well, Dale, thanks so much for being here. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.